So the formation of bone is called ossification or osteogenesis, and it happens by two means, either by intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. That means that the bone is either developing between membranes or it's replacing cartilage, endo meaning inside, chondro referring to cartilage. In intramembranous ossification, we'll see the production of flat bones of the skull and the clavicle or the sternum. Now, there's a lot of detail presented on intermembranous ossification. I don't want you to know the details so much as just generally what happens. What we'll see is some of the embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme condenses into a layer. It's filled with blood capillaries. These mesenchymal cells will enlarge and differentiate into osteogenic cells. Here, they'll form a network of soft sheets that will be called trabeculae. The osteogenic cells will then gather on the trabeculae and differentiate into osteoblasts. These osteoblasts will then deposit an organic matrix called the osteoid tissue. You can see here layers of osteoblasts depositing this blue layer of osteoid tissue. This is where we start seeing entrapment of the first osteocytes and formation of some of the periosteum. The osteoblasts will continue to deposit minerals and produce a honeycomb of bony trabeculae. Some of the trabeculae persist as permanent spongy bone, while other parts will be reabsorbed by osteoclasts and remodeled to form a marrow cavity in the middle of the bone. The trabeculae at the surface continue to calcify until the spaces between them are filled in. This converts the spongy bone into compact bone. This process is what gives rise to the sandwich-like arrangement typical of a flat bone, where we have spongy bone in the middle and compact bone on either side. In this histology slide, you can see this osteogenic layer where you see the osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts are putting out this layer of osteoid tissue. You can also see development of the periosteum, the two layers, the fibrous outer layer and the osteogenic inner layer containing these osteoblast cells. In endochondral ossification, bone develops from a pre-existing cartilage model. So first of all, the skeleton develops in cartilage, and then it's replaced by bone. This process of endochondral ossification begins in the 6th week of fetal development and ends in the early 20s when the bones finally stop growing in length. Here we'll see that the mesenchyme will develop into the body of hyaline cartilage, which is covered with a fibrous perichondrium. Eventually, the perichondrium will stop producing chondrocytes and begin producing osteoblasts. These osteoblasts will deposit a thin collar of bone around the bone, and they'll encircle it like a ring, providing physical reinforcement to the cartilage below. The former perichondrium is now considered to be periosteum. The chondrocytes in the middle of the model are going to enlarge, and the matrix between the lacunae is reduced to really thin walls. This is the region of chondrocyte enlargement, and it's called primary ossification center. We'll see blood vessels penetrate the new bone tissue. Now, osteoclasts in the marrow cavity are going to widen the cavity by dissolving some calcified cartilage remnants. And we'll see production of a secondary ossification center in the epiphyses of the bones. Basically, the bone covers up the cartilage, growing out along the length from the primary ossification center, and the secondary ossification centers will be in the epiphyses, growing towards the bone. The adult bone has a single marrow cavity and closed epiphyseal plates. At this point, the bone has reached its maximum length. This is an X-ray showing the epiphyseal growth plates. You can see many different long bones in the hand, and at the end of each, you'll see the epiphyseal plates, and the epiphyseal growth plate is the space in between those. So ossification begins during fetal development and continues throughout life with bone growth, and then after bones have reached their full length with the remodeling of bones. Bones will grow in two directions, length and width, and these growth processes are quite different. During bone elongation, we'll see growth at the epiphyseal plate. This is a region of transition from cartilage to bone. There are various growth zones in this elongation region. They consist of typical hyaline cartilage in the middle and a transition zone on either side where the cartilage is being replaced by bone. The metaphysis is the zone of transition that faces the bone marrow cavity. You can see all these zones illustrated here in this figure. We'll come back to here and look at it in more detail shortly. We'll see several different zones. There's a zone of reserve cartilage, a zone of proliferation, a zone of hypertrophy, and then we start getting into the calcification, zone of calcification, and a zone of bone deposition. Before we get into the super details of this, let's look at what this picture is showing us. We're looking at a piece of the epiphyseal plate here on the diaphyseal side. Remember that the bone is on this side in the diaphysis, and the cartilage is this blue area in the middle. So basically what happens is from the epiphyseal side, we'll see a raining of new cartilage tissue down. So in this region, we've got cartilage tissue. Cells are dividing, they're being pushed down in towards the bony area. And then as these tissues are pushed down, we'll see that ossification happens in an upward direction. So ossification is going from the side where the bone is towards the space in the middle, this blue area of cartilage. So cartilage grows continually outwards from this epiphyseal plate. That cartilage is going down towards the bone, and as the cartilage is deposited, bony tissue will be deposited over it in an upward direction. So again, the cartilage cells rain down in this picture, and the bone is replacing the cartilage, growing upwards. So let's look at these zones in more detail. Now we have a picture of the general way bones grow in length. In the zone of reserve cartilage, we have hyaline cartilage that's furthest from the marrow cavity. This shows no sign of transitioning into bone. Then we move down a zone. In the zone of cell proliferation, we'll see that chondrocytes are multiplying and lining up in rows of small flattened lacunae. In the zone of hypertrophy, guess what? The cells are hypertrophying. They're growing. There's no longer any mitosis going on, but these chondrocytes are growing larger and they're thinning the walls between them. Then we move down into the zone of calcification. This is where we'll see temporary calcification of cartilage between the columns of the lacunae. And then in the lowest zone here, the red zone, we see the zone of bone deposition. This is where we're breaking down all the old walls of the cartilage. Chondrocytes are dying, and bone is being deposited by osteoblasts. So again, we've got cartilage growing in a downward direction and osseous tissue growing up over that cartilage. So as we see more and more cartilage produced in this epiphyseal growth plate, we'll see more and more bone replacing it. Thus, the bone is growing. And this happens on either side of the epiphysis. Here's an image of a fetal skeleton at 12 weeks. Most of the skeleton here is cartilaginous. However, some of the larger bones are beginning to ossify. When we see bone growth and remodeling, we'll see bone growth in length, which is called interstitial bone growth. This is the situation we just looked at. It's growth at the epiphyseal plate. Once the epiphysis closes, there's no more cartilage. We call it an epiphyseal line, and the lengthwise growth of the bone is finished. It occurs at different ages in different bones, but by the early 20s, length of bone growth is generally finished. Apositional growth, however, is when we're increasing the bone's width throughout life. We'll see constant deposition of new bone at the surface. The osteoblasts on the deep side of the periosteum, the membrane around the bone, are going to deposit osteoid tissue. The cells become trapped as the tissue calcifies. We're laying down matrix in layers parallel to the surface of the bone. This is how we get development of the circumferential lamellae on the surface of the bone. At the same time, in order to keep the bone less dense, we'll have osteoclast activity on the endosteum, the membrane on the inner side, on the marrow cavity. And they're constantly widening the marrow cavity in order to acquire bone growth in width without making them really heavy and clunky. So both interstitial and apositional growth will happen throughout a person's growth phase of life. But after growth is complete, we'll still see constant bone remodeling. We'll see about 10% of our bone material exchanged each year. We'll also see that bone remodeling is involved in repairing fractures. It's involved in releasing minerals into the blood, and it can reshape bones in response to use and disuse. Remember that we looked at that image of the trabeculae of spongy bone forming along the lines of stress? Well, the more stress you apply to a bone, the more the osteoblasts will be stimulated to produce more dense bone. So this is a good thing. If we're doing a lot of weight bearing and strenuous exercise, having our muscles exert a lot on our bones, then they'll become much stronger. When we start looking at bones themselves, we'll see that there are many features all over the bones for muscle attachment. The more that the muscle works on the bone, the larger these features become as the bone remodels itself in response to stress. Wolff's law of bone describes exactly this. He describes that the architecture of bone is determined by the mechanical stresses that are placed on it. So bones adapt to withstand these mechanical stresses. So remodeling is a collaborative and precise action of osteoblasts laying down new bone and osteoclasts dissolving old bone where it's no longer needed. Achondroplastic dwarfism is a condition in which the long bones stop growing in length during childhood. So we'll see a normal torso length and short limbs. The problem is that the cartilage doesn't grow at the metaphysis. Now, this is a genetic mutation that's produced by a dominant allele. There's another type of dwarfism called pituitary dwarfism, where an individual lacks growth hormone, and thus normal bone growth in length and width is not possible. People with pituitary dwarfism have normal proportions, but very short stature. Okay, so it's time for one more diagram. We want to establish how bone grows in length. I want you to spend some time with this figure. You can even use it as the basis of your diagram to show the various zones. Rather than you just telling me what's going on in each zone, I would like you to explain in general what's going on. The idea that you understand that the cartilage is raining down from these upper zones and that ossifying tissue is growing up and over it. So explaining in general how the bone is growing in length, rather than highlighting exactly what's happening in each particular zone. I want it to play more like an animation, a diagram with some movement in it, rather than distinct zones. So spend some time wrapping your brain around this concept of how bones grow in length. And then think about apositional growth, how bones grow in width. and that it's a balancing act between osteoblasts in the periosteum and osteoclasts in the endosteum. And that brings us to the end of this section. So we'll move on next to the physiology of osseous tissue. See you soon.